Welcome to the Early Founder Podcast. My name is Philip, and I run a high school startup incubator called Launchpad, where I lead high schoolers nationwide through the startup process with the help of industry veterans. Along this journey, I was curious to see what makes an entrepreneur successful, what traits, experiences, and habits they possess, especially while they're young. So that's why I made the Early Founder, to have conversations with those who have made massive breakthroughs at a young age and to share their experiences with other aspiring founders. Today's guest is Zach Laberge, a 19-year-old serial entrepreneur who founded his first company, Frenter, at just 14, taking his earliest calls from a broom closet at school. Frenter, a platform revolutionizing equipment rental and fleet management, has been more than influential in powering construction rental companies across North America. Now, Zach is back in stealth building Omen AI. Between both companies, Zach has raised $7.2 million by the time he was 18 years old. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me on.
Amazing. So my first question is, where does your company stand today, and what milestone are you most proud of so far?
Yeah, I mean, we're still building. I think, big learnings coming into this company was like definitely keeping the team as lean as possible and as focused as possible. And so very proud of some of the cool technical milestones we're seeing. I mean, there's lots of work to do still for sure. But being just a couple of us working really hard on like one very specific problem gives us a lot of leeway of like, hey, we can, hyper focus on certain issues and then solve stuff, and we iterate very quick. And so we also have our own, heavy equipment and stuff to play around with. And so we're, excited about some of the kind of cool milestones we're seeing on the tech side, and then excited really to get our tech in the field.
Yeah. For the audience, can you give me a quick elevator pitch of what Frenter is?
Yeah, sure. So what I was doing at Frenter was I started it as a tour rental marketplace when I was in high school. Then after I spent a few years on that, I went and pivoted that company to do kind of website building and inventory management systems for heavy equipment companies. And then after that, I went and pivoted the company to do like GPS telematics tracking and like actually putting hardware onto heavy equipment. Exited that business last year. But yeah, spent 4.5 years building, pivoted many times, raised, millions of dollars for it, and kind of went through the whole startup journey of like, this little idea that I had when I was still back in Canada, in Eastern Canada, and then, raised a little bit, built it, pivoted, raised a little bit more, all that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah. So can you tell me a bit about what you're working on now? I know you're still in stealth.
Yeah. I mean, basically took all the learnings from years of building in the industry and said, okay, this industry is super reactive by nature. And so can we be more predictive? And, how do we do that? We don't believe that the existing tools are good enough to do so. And so our concept was like, can we supercharge that by building our own tools to be predictive? And so, we're building a prediction platform and starting with construction and eventually every other industry in the world. So.
Very cool. So rewinding a bit to the early spark. So what were your very first experiences with entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I started, first company was maybe in grade 6 or 5. And it was, I started selling smartwatches to my like very friends at school. I bought them from Alibaba. I heard about this website called Alibaba, which, I thought at the time was like the super secretive website, but ordered maybe like 15 smartwatches for like $10 each. So maybe $150. I have a twin brother, so I split it with him. And then we sold it to our friends for like $40 per watch. And so we did pretty good. Maybe sold like 10 of those. I still have one to this day in my office. I kept around, but it's it was a cool little business and a fun kind of first project of like, sourcing product, selling product, and helped me in my kind of next business that I worked on after that. So.
Mm-hmm. So moving on from there, when did you realize you wanted to build something of your own, leading to the creation of Frenter?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tried a bunch of different projects. I had dog cookie company that, I was fun, and I sourced, the bags from Alibaba and designed them and sold them across North America, did a Kickstarter, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I always wanted to do something by myself. I just probably didn't know, I wanted to build something big. And I think when I was younger, I didn't know exactly what that could be. You know what I mean? Like, you think, dog cookies, unfortunately, it's very tough to build a $1 billion company doing that. And like, although people have done it, like Martha Stewart and other people, it's tough to do. And so I thought that, you know, I wanted to build something that was like scalable. And I was like, okay, what are interesting ideas to work on? I was always very interested in like the rental industry. And so I was like, okay, that's kind of cool. There's Airbnb. Maybe I do Airbnb for stuff. And that was kind of it. It was just like whiteboarding one day, brainstorm on a cool idea. Cool. I'm going to go work on it. So.
Mm. Can you tell me why you decided to pick construction as the industry to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't when we started. I started by renting like everything. We had, everything from tools and bikes and flamethrowers and a bunch of other stuff. Like, it was whatever, right? And then you kind of, it's iterative. Like you say, okay, we doesn't really make people don't really rent hammers. That doesn't really make sense. Okay, well then, maybe we go to bikes. Well, there's lots of companies that were doing bikes, and so it's like, cool. Maybe we go to bigger iron, and then we started to move towards like higher value assets. And then we were like, okay, well, what other tools do these people that own higher value assets need? And then started to try to service them and offer them some tools as well. And so, it was like more so kind of getting pulled this way and learning that this was a lot more interesting than, someone saying, hey, like go focus on construction, because that's definitely not where I started.
Hmm. I see. So when you were working at this like relatively early stage, right? Were there specific people or events that especially inspired you or encouraged you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was fortunate. I had, a decent network that was supportive in, back where I'm from in Atlantic Canada, there was like an ecosystem for young startup founders. And so
Mm.
I was like brought in and I had a desk for maybe a year that I worked out of, and then, got an office. And so I met lots of people in this kind of co-working space, and, various stages of business, and, you know, um, some that I wanted to emulate, and maybe some that like were really good, like learnings that, hey, maybe, you shouldn't do that or shouldn't try. But everybody kind of had some, I would, there's not like a specific person, maybe a couple like really cool people. But I would say more so like just got to learn and kind of see other people doing it. And I was like, cool, that seems like, I should try that as well. So.
Hmm. So you were part of like a Canadian co-working space. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was just a like kind of a startup incubator called Volta in Nova Scotia, and so
Hmm.
I'm from Halifax, Nova Scotia. And it was, like it started like as a place like you rent a desk and you just kind of hang out and you get to be around other people that are also renting desks and working on projects. And then, we started renting a bigger office, and then eventually we moved to our own space, our own headquarters in Halifax. But definitely like. Yeah, just imagine like dozens of people all working on different startups, all at kind of various stages in their startup, all kind of together. So it's kind of a cool, and then, they throw events and pitch contests and that kind of stuff. So that was like my first taste of like pitching VCs and pitching judges and that kind of stuff.
Very cool. So diving into building the venture itself. So once you had a clear idea for Frenter, what were the very first steps you took to get things off the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I think I spent like a year almost building a business plan for it, which is definitely like not what you should do. I'm like wouldn't do that the second go around, but I spent a lot of time like mapping out this like 20-page business plan on what we're gonna do and what the market is and all that kind of stuff. And I think partly because I didn't really know where to start, because when I was younger I wasn't very technical, I wasn't able to build it myself, and so I was just like, well, what are things that can occupy my time? Well, that seems kind of interesting. Um, and so then I got a little bit of money from some local angels and some friends and family with my business plan. So, maybe it was worthwhile, but like pitched them this idea, hey, built a pitch deck, all this kind of stuff with the plan, and then got a little bit of money. I contracted out our early development to a development firm. And then, got my first platform built for like 20 grand, I think it cost me. And, got it, launched it. And then kind of ran a bunch of ads on it. And so like again, all of this was like stuff I hadn't done before, so it was pretty interesting like first learnings and my first kind of time playing around with like Facebook advertising and all that kind of stuff to promote my business. But yeah, it was definitely like slow, like gradual process for the first like year and a bit. So.
Yeah. So how did you go about getting early validation and your first customer for your idea?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely changed. Like, the first go around, I was definitely not validating it. And, I just built it before I talked to
Yeah.
anybody about like, hey, would you want to rent stuff? Which I would say is like, and I don't want to speak, but it's like probably a pretty similar story for most first time entrepreneurs. Like and it's just like you want to launch something you think is interesting. So and like anyway, I launched it. We actually got we got thousands of users in our first month or so. So we had decent like validation, but I think that was more so like how we pitched it. Like, you know, we were in a good time because COVID was just kind of ending, lockdowns were ending, and so people wanted to get outside. We promoted ourselves as like being renting bikes and offering them ways to get outside and to kind of take back summer and to do other stuff. And so that was a big campaign I ran, which worked pretty good. Um, but then, like, you know, for my other businesses and my other products, it's like I focused long before I had built anything for my current company. I had customers, large customers with signed contracts, and like it was, you know, very, very different than like, you know, raising money, launching my company with, you know, an idea and like without talking to anybody. And like the second go around this time, I was like, cool. Who are all these big companies I know? Cool. What are your guys' problems? Great. Okay, that's what I'm going to build. And then after that, I raised some money, and then after that, I brought on my co-founder, and then we built out the product and system. But like very different steps than the other way around. I definitely do kind of the latter of the two if I had to do it again.
Yeah. When you say you ran a couple campaigns, what would you use to do? Like, what platforms would you use? How did you, immerse yourself in this community?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that that's probably like a similar trend between all businesses is like really understanding and, you know, knowing where your customers live. So when it was consumers renting stuff, well, you know, they're on Facebook. Like that was kind of you know, 40 plus year old guy or gal that wants to rent out their bikes they have or stuff in their shed. Cool. They're going to be on Facebook. When it was heavy equipment rental companies at my last company. And, you know, similar to this one, it's like, where do those guys live? Well, it's probably not on Facebook. Even if the individual people are on Facebook, they're probably not on there looking for, you know, telematics software, right? So
Yeah.
then I'd go to like events and trade shows where they were at, or, you know, I was fortunate to get invited on to like a lot of podcasts in the industry, and get to talk about my story and what I was doing. So I think like, yeah, you got to really understand, you know, where these guys are living, where they're operating, because, you know, it can be tough for young founders when, especially in like these older industries, when like they put out a bunch of Facebook ads and they don't get anything. Well, it's because like those guys aren't on Facebook, right? So you like got to go
Yeah.
to the trade shows, which is definitely weird when you're like 16, 17. And I was going to these trade shows or sponsoring events and golf tournaments. But it's it's like what you got to do, right? So
Yeah, yeah. I would say the construction industry is known for being pretty traditional, right? So, did you face any challenges breaking into it, and how would you manage to drive real innovation while you're in that community?
yeah, I think it's like it's not an overlooked industry in the way of like, you know, and I had a really good conversation with a friend of mine about this a couple weeks ago. He's a GC, my friend, and you know, we were talking about it's an industry where like it's on the outside, yeah, it's like kind of tough to get in, but then you also see like what people build, right? Like a lot of these people build what they know, right? So you see a lot of like there's a billion different time tracking softwares out there. There's a billion different you know, like inventory management, you know, lots of those type of tools. And, you know, whether they're all good or not, and yes, some have merit, I don't know enough to understand it, but I do know from talking to my friends who are in the industry, they see a lot of the same stuff, right? And so I think it's more so like why it's tough to break in is because I think that people take a one view kind of look at it and they look at it from one angle and they say, cool, this is clearly what these guys need. They have no technology. And actually, like in real life, these guys are using self-driving machines on site. They're using LiDAR to scan and map, you know, 3D imaging. They have like total 3D scans of the buildings they're going to build. I mean, you know, my family, just kind of, you know, been building some small projects right now and I've been working on them. And it's like, you know, it's quite a not complex, interesting process. So like, I think that's like one thing is like, you got to give credit where credit is due. And it's definitely a super innovative industry. Um, and I also think that like what was kind of cool in it is that being young in the industry, like people are definitely like super willing to help, which is, you know, uh, the other like different than maybe some other industries. And like we're that they're saturated with young people, and so you're not interesting if you're a young person in the space. Um, and so yeah, I would just caveat it with like yeah, if you're not getting a response from people, it's like well, if you're only pinging like 10 people a day on LinkedIn, you're probably not going to get like some responses, and the industry is going to feel like mean to you, right? But like you know,
Yeah,
if you're going to trade shows, you're meeting people, you're talking to people, you're asking for intros, you're you know paying them back with help, and you're trying to provide value yourself. I think like then you're going to get something super interesting. But like a one way of hey, I'm young, talk to me is just not going to work. Like you know, people don't really respond to LinkedIn; it's oversaturated. People don't really respond to email. You got to get in front of these people in other ways, you know. So
yeah. So key point is know your customer, know where to find them, know your industry very well.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, exactly.
you raised $2.8 million when you were 17. What was your approach to securing funding, and how did you convince investors to back your vision?
Um, yeah, I mean, it's fun. Like, people like big numbers are cool, but then like when you actually look at them, you're like, okay, I raised lots of money, but not all at once, right? And so it's like,
Yeah.
now for my new company, everything we raised was kind of one round, but like for the last one, it was like, my first round was 155K that I raised when I was 15 in high school, and I just left high school. And like, tiny round of funding, that's not a real, but that was my like pre-seed, right? And then, uh, but that's what people were willing to give me and take a bet on me, and it's like cool. Then I prove some kind of it's like dominoes, right? Like you flip over or a bingo card, so you flip over a couple bingo cards. Cool, it's a little bit less de-risked. I'm closer to getting bingo, which is like $1 billion company, and so cool. I got a couple letters or a couple of squares, whatever, and then great. Then I think I got another 255 was like my next round,
Yeah.
and like kind of kept going from there. So I'd say like one big trend, like also the investors that gave me money when we were idea stage, like the angels and early supporters, weren't the investors that gave me money when we were going out and raising, like our $2 million like actual seed round, like very different investors. And like I think I probably transitioned from local angels to then I went to Silicon Valley and raised money there. But I mean, I think I sent 2,000 emails for my first round. So like,
Wow.
cold emails, like you got to hustle. I would say like when you have no network, like I did, you got to hustle. And I think I had like 12 investors, you know what I mean? It's a low conversion rate, right? And most of those were like warm intros. And then when I built my network, my rounds got a lot quicker. It was like, I was using warm intros. I was calling people I know. And then like for my most, recent company, it's like, we had an idea, we had a signed contract, and I texted a bunch of people I knew, and we put a great round together with some cool people, right? But like, you can't do that when you have no network and you're not in the space. And I think like then you just gotta substitute that by hustling. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Did you ever have to significantly change your direction or pivot? And what prompted that, and how did you handle it?
yeah, it's funny. It's a good question. Because yeah, my round when I was working on my marketplace, I went out to this investor, this famous investor, named John Risley, who's a billionaire from Nova Scotia. He founded the largest seafood company or lobster company in the world. Also, many other telecommunications companies. Very successful guy, and a good mentor of mine over the years. And so I pitched him, and he said, "Look, I don't love this tool rental marketplace. It's not a good idea, frankly, but." I like if you started working on and selling website builders and other stuff of these businesses, that's kind of interesting, like a Shopify for rental companies.
Mm.
And so I was kind of, just starting my round. And he was like, I'll give you 50 grand. Because that was, I pitched him with two ideas. I pitched him with the tour rental marketplace, and I pitched him with the business idea. And he was like, stop the tour rental marketplace, go work on this. And so, listen to him, made the change. Then all of a sudden, a bunch of more people were way more interested in my tour rental marketplace idea. And so I think like, that was like a mid round kind of pivot, but like we pivoted and moved the company a lot. And like some people are scared to pivot. I think investors invest in like pre-seed and are like upset that you pivoted. You know, maybe like yeah, I don't know. I like you're meant to pivot your company like fun. If you were a straight shooter like every time you had a perfect like the bingo card was already like unlocked, then there's not much of an investment to be made, right? It's like well then like if you knew it was going to work, then why'd you go raise money for it? Just go like raise like put your own money at stake. You know what I mean? And like I think kind of the point is like well nobody knows it's going to work. Even the huge companies that like are very successful. Maybe they have a well validated thesis, but they don't know it's going to work. And so like you got to figure out your market, and that's kind of what the money's for, is like to figure things out and kind of knock off these bingo squares. And so yeah, I think a couple of times I had to do that and kind of pivot, mid thing. And like even my current company, maybe the thesis is the same, but we've changed kind of the direction and maybe the technology we want to build a few times. Like there's definitely like internal changes that don't have to be huge pivots, but maybe like a small pivot in how we think about things.
Yeah. I have a question. So, are you currently attending any like post high school education?
No, I left high school when I was 16.
Yeah.
And I did some online school after that.
Okay. What led you to that decision and like allowed you to make that like leap of faith?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you ask any entrepreneur like that, and especially the ones I know, like I have my roommates are quite successful young founders as well, and like I think that what's interesting is like all of them had to go full time on it to like both
Yeah.
build something like I think more like out of the ordinary, more like exceptional. Like, look, if you want to work on a side hustle during high school, like I mean, I did that on multiple businesses, and I ran them easily in my high school. I think when you want to raise money, like I am very a big believer in like, especially if you're young, like when you're old and you have a family, it's a little bit different. And like if you have existing commitments for sure, then you got to think about it. Maybe you're running on the weekends, but like when you're young and like you're you have a lot of safety nets, especially when you live at home and you're in high school and all that kind of stuff. And so I definitely think that like a huge like like green flag for like an entrepreneur is like, hey, he's willing to hustle and work on this. And so again, some people may disagree. Some people might be like, oh, I'll fund this kid when he's still in high school. It's like, that's totally cool. I just didn't want to do that. And I didn't think I could do that. You know what I mean? So I was just like, all right, I'm going to drop out and I'm going to raise money. And I think that's what investors want. And it worked. I would have felt really silly if I dropped out and didn't raise any money. So,
Yeah.
it's like a success mentality, right? Or like success bias. So,
Did you face any unique logistical or personal challenges because you were so young?
yeah, I mean, I think when you get your network is bigger, I think maybe less like young. Yeah, maybe age is a part of it, but like, people, can kind of like until you become successful enough that they can't do that, people always are going to kind of dismiss you. And I got like I got really good treatment on the one hand because I was young, and people would open doors for me that maybe they wouldn't talk to a founder that cold outreach, but then they would because I was young and they gave me an interesting opportunity. On the other hand, people thought that they could like ghost me and kind of treat me like shit, and like you get that, and you don't work with those people on the next go round, and like whatever. I have more of a choice on who I want to work with this company, and so I get to be more selective here. But like, yeah, when that kind of sucked when I was like 15, 16, and some guy would be like total dick to me, or like would ghost me. It's not fun. I mean, it's not fun for anybody. I think everybody kind of deals with that. But then I would say definitely like positives outweigh the negatives. You know what I mean? Because like, and then on the other hand, people would be like, give me opportunity and give me support and be willing to spend more time with me that maybe they wouldn't if I was like 35 and asking for help, right? So
Yeah. You mention your network pretty often. How did you go about fostering your network and, building a community out of it?
yeah, I'm a huge believer in like this concept of like the world is very bad at doing the bare minimum. And so like I think like the bare minimum of hey, Philip, we're talking today, and I think you're a good guy. I'm gonna follow up with you in a couple of months and see how you just check in, like be a good person, right? Most people don't do that. Most people are just like, cool, I got on my podcast with Philip, great, I'm never gonna talk to this guy again. Or like let me ping him when I want something again. You know what I mean? And it doesn't have to be for the pod. It can be for anything. Like it can be a founder you met at an event. It can be and don't be disingenuous with it. Like don't have like automated like outreach to people, and like you like don't be targeted with it. You don't need a spreadsheet to manage your relationships necessarily. But I do think like I was always very good at like I my biggest investors in my last company were a fund called 1517 Fund, and I remember I pitched this guy Nick, his partner there, a couple of times. I pitched him when I first started. I pitched him a couple of months later when we launched the marketplace. I pitched him probably over the course of a year and a half before they ended up investing. And like, the bear, like both it's the tenacity of like coming back to people, which I think is interesting to investors, but also like for like mentors and stuff. It's like, a couple of my mentors said, like, I was one of the few people that they give advice to, and I'd come back to them in a few months and say, hey, here's what I did with your advice. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't work. Like that's bare minimum. That's just being a good person. And like, kind of bare minimum relationship building 101, but just most people don't do it, unfortunately. And that's just, the reality of the world. People get busy. People think they're busy. There's fake busyness for sure. And so, yeah, if you want to summarize it in like one word, it's just like be a good person, I guess, or like try to lead, like treat others how you want to be treated. Which again, a very like well-known phrase, but just people don't do it, and it works, And I think that I just tried to try to emulate that, and it's helped me so far, So
I think that's fantastic advice. I think it's also something that, not even just in the startup world, people should start engaging with regularly, right? Just
yeah, for sure.
be a good person, like following up, checking in on people. It's good, yeah. So moving into, some challenges and breakthroughs, right? So when you were building Frenter and also with your startup now, what's your secret to, differentiating your offering among a sea of similar companies?
Yeah. I mean, for the first go, we had a hard time differentiating ourselves. And so we did that was tough. And that meant that we were really selling like, I would say what you don't want to sell against in saturated markets is you don't want to sell on price. And I think, let's just take an example like GPS tracking. I can buy a GPS tracker on Amazon, or I can go to some very fancy, well-known public companies, and I can buy very expensive GPS trackers from them. At the end of the day, all I want to know is where my excavator is. And so, I have an excavator that we own, and I track it with a crappy Amazon tracker, but it works, right? It solves the core problem of where it is, and hopefully no one steals it, right? And I think like when you're fighting on price, well, then you're battling how cheap can you manufacture it, how cheap can you sell it, how cheap can you acquire a customer, and it's very tough for a startup to do that. And yeah, a couple $1 million is enough to subsidize to something, but it's in reality not that much money. And so that's kind of interesting. And I would say like when we were trying to run it back, it's like how they're harder to find. You got to look a little bit like under kind of the open lift up the rock type of thing, lift up the floorboards. But like when you find industries that like your product offering is like very differentiated or very new, well, it can be maybe hard. You got to do a little bit of education. But like then that's more of like a messaging differentiation and a how you pitch things differentiation. Then when people have direct comps that are very well established, it's unless you're like drastically better, which is hard to do in some of these industries, like then you're fighting on price, which is very tough to win. So I would say like at Frenter, we battled for our sales and we got some, and we got, strong customers that were good to us and like that, but we had to hustle for them. And I had a team of salespeople that I worked with to get them. Like for this one, the fact that we closed some really impressive companies with just me and Johnny and us showing the tech and what we built, like is really awesome because it's a much more of a, people understand the product and the problem. And I don't need like, it's not a numbers game. It's like most people we reach out to are pretty interested. And, right now we're just battling bandwidth right now to deploy what we build. So.
Yeah. You mentioned that, you contracted your first prototype, right? Would you suggest doing something like that, especially when you're beginning, or would you suggest, becoming more technical?
Yeah, I would never do that again. And like, I've gotten semi-technical over the years. I'm no expert, but I can understand things a lot better than when I was younger. But like, our first platform, we outsourced everything in my last business. And eventually I built out a team of maybe 6 or 7 engineers in house, and we were building some features in house, but it wasn't enough and we didn't get enough output. So we still spent 60, 70,000 a month on outsourced developers in Argentina and a bunch of other places. And so I think that having and this is very different than like CMs, like contract manufacturers that build a product that you built, very, very different, but like purely from building, coding, and I wouldn't do it. And if I were to do it, you still need a CTO. Like they don't replace a CTO or a strong technical lead. And so I would say like definitely build a strong base yourself. And like whether it's you or whether it's a co-founder's technical, less important, somebody needs to be. And then figure out your vision of what you want to build beforehand, and not just, hey, this is my idea, but actually do something about it. Because when you're using these outsourced firms to ideate, it's very expensive. These guys are $250 an hour. They're not your friend. Maybe they want to be your friend and advisor, but they're a very expensive friend and advisor.
Yeah.
And so like, if you want to shoot the shit with someone, call your dad, call your mom and brainstorm with them at least, in some way, or call a friend, you know what I mean? But like, I would never outsource development this early. Because I think that like there's a lot of core learnings that you get from customers that when the train's already left the station and I'm building this thing and I've spent, 25,000 building this thing, I can't stop it anymore. You know what I mean? Like even if I get a brand new learning that says I'm throwing out this business, I'm launching something else. So
yeah, I think a key feature in a lot of the founders that I've interviewed is either they're very technical themselves or they have someone around them who's very technical, right? Because you need someone in-house who's ready to make those changes immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
My follow-up question to that, a little bit unrelated, is has it started? When has it started to feel like you've kind of made it, or how should I phrase this question? It's like, has there been a point where it's felt like you've made it big?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny, right? So like when I was younger, I was like, okay, when I raise $2 million, I'm gonna be a real company, right? Or like maybe even less than that. Maybe when I raise, but like you get there and you're like, cool, it's kind of the same old, same old. Maybe your team's a little bigger. Maybe the guys you hire are a little bit better, but like it's kind of the same, right? And I was like, okay, for sure, when I raise a couple $1 million, we're going to be a real company. Well, we raised $4 million. I didn't really feel like a real company, by any of those means. And not that like, but you talk to my friends. I have friends that build multi-billion-dollar companies, and like the same thing. It's like, maybe, when they get a little bit more established, okay, when you ring the bell on the NASDAQ, like some of my friends have done, yeah, you feel like you've made it, when your company goes public, right? But like, I think honestly, like, you still deal with a lot of the same problems. You still got to manage burn, even when you raise 20 million or 2 million or 100K, you still got to manage burn.
Yeah.
You still have an end of life until you're profitable. And so that those stresses still come up. You still got to figure out all of these other things. And, I like, again, I raised lots of money in my life, and like, it's fun, right? Like, it's just a still fun project, me building a fun project. Just like how it was when I first started. And maybe I have more resources for it, and maybe I do a little bit differently. But like, I would say, if someone's like, man, I made it and I've raised $3 million, that's probably a red flag for an entrepreneur, because I think what we're all trying to build when we raise money is much bigger than that. You know what I mean? And this is just such a baby moment, in our life, and like in our life of a startup. So, yeah, that's kind of what I'd say. But like, I have friends that like, they sell their company for $100 million, and they were telling me, man, like, we were getting low on runway and thinking through shit. Or like, friends that raised like many millions, and they're like, same thing, they're getting low on runway. But again, success bias, right? At the end of the day, everybody says, we were always crushing and we were doing great, but when you kind of look under the hood, it's like everybody kind of deals with the same problems, right? So
Yeah, that's a very interesting insight. I think it also speaks to for audience members, it provides some very interesting advice for how they should move forward. Looking ahead, where do you see yourself heading in the next couple of years?
yeah, I mean, I think I love this industry, and I want to keep working in it. And like, every time I think that I have solved it or found all the problems, I learn something brand new. And I think, it's a lot of fun. I get to spend a lot of time with my customers. I get to go on sites and play with heavy machinery, and that's kind of what I love to do. And so, it's if I can keep doing that, I can keep finding other really interesting problems. I'm going to keep doing that, and maybe my ideas and my visions are going to get bigger and bigger, and my ambition is going to keep growing there. But like, I think I'm going to still try to work with the same customers, get advice from the same type of people, and keep doing better at it. But I think I found like my little niche where I seem to really, I really like it. So, for now, and maybe there's something else I want to do down the road, but like, next 5 years for sure, it's like, cool, I'll be 24. I think if I spend this time learning the construction industry, and maybe over like more like the dirt world in general, I'll be in a good spot. So
Yeah, great. In the upcoming 5 years, have you set any personal goals for yourself beyond the business?
yeah, I have a couple personal goals, uh, that maybe I don't want to share, but it's like, there's
Yeah.
definitely like some internal goals that you're like, cool, like, this would be very cool, like, for my own like, slight, like, my own ambition. It's like, I want to hit this, like, whether it's a number, whether it's whatever it is, I mean, you can guess what those are, you know what I mean? But like, I think uh those, I've also learned that like, whenever you focus on those things, you know maybe they happen, maybe they don't, but they're probably like, it takes your time away from doing the work that gets you there, right? And like, talking about doing the work and talking about how much money you're going to have when the work is done is not actually doing the work. And so I think that,
Yeah.
I've just tried to like lock in and be like, cool, I'm going to focus on my stuff. And as I see in like my life already, it's like, it's not linear, you know what I mean? Like, it just, I could never have predicted, like 2 weeks after I had exited Frenter, having millions of dollars raised from my next company. It's like, I could never have predicted that. You know what I mean? Like, exactly 2 weeks later, but it's like, it happened, and so it's like, cool. I'm just kind of the mindset of, let me just keep focusing, doing the work, and then I'll get rewarded in whatever way that is, right? But
Yeah, great. So moving on to our final section, which is advice in closing. What's one piece of advice you'd give to a teenager who wants to make a startup tomorrow?
yeah, I think I'd just be like, cool, man. Like, let's take a step back, and like, let's think about all the different um, like, what do you actually want to do here? And like, what I mean by that is like, I think that some people just want to start a startup, and that's totally valid. And especially in, all these kind of hype cycles, people launch a crypto company whether in 21, or they launch a climate company a little bit before that, like, whatever they launch something. And just to kind of be a part of the trend. And so I'd be like, cool, let's take a step back and let's think about like, let's be very critical, because I think like, it's tough for young founders. We want to be super optimistic, which is a really awesome trait that we have. But then, when I used to think that I was the only tool rental marketplace in the world, it's like, not true. thousands of other tool rental marketplaces, right? So I'd be like, cool, like let's just solve a problem. And then like once you find a cool problem, then I think that's where the optimism really helps because then you just run at the wall and you just figure things out and you hustle like crazy. So I would say like that'd be like the first piece. If if I was getting started, I had to like every time when I restarted, when I talk to other people that are like starting from scratch, it's like cool, let's find a problem. Because like that's the first piece versus like this is a cool idea, let me go work on it, or I'm going to build like AI for like this because it makes sense on paper, but like lots of ideas make sense on paper, lots of ideas raise millions of dollars and don't do anything, right? So
Yeah. Do you have any resources that you would recommend for young founders?
um yeah, I mean, I think I always liked YouTube, like and like very general resource, but like there's channels like one called like Business Casual that was always very interesting, and it was like the Stripe brothers story and the story of Airbnb and all that kind of stuff. That was kind of a good one I liked when I was younger. There's lots of interesting ones that kind of explain venture capital, that type of piece, exiting a company, all that type of stuff. So that was pretty interesting. The stories on a bunch. Yeah, I'd say there's lots of YouTube videos and like it's not like a specific channel, but like I always loved hearing the stories of other people because you kind of learn things and it gives you some context. Um, I'd say that's one, and then I'd say like the second thing is just like you go on LinkedIn and you hustle and you get in front of cool people, and a lot of the mentors that like I met were from outreaching and reaching out to, and like be surprised the amount of people that respond to you, and then all of a sudden you have someone in your corner that you didn't have before. So
Yeah. Are there any specific skills or traits that you would say have made a difference for you and have been influential in shaping your journey?
yeah, I mean, maybe you can tell by like how I talk to you about things, but like I'm pretty even keel guy. Like I don't, I try not to get like too pumped about things, and I also don't get too bummed out about things either. Which I think it can be, maybe it can be bad because I don't celebrate the wins as much, but I also think that like it's helpful from a like perseverance perspective. It's like when I want to keep working on stuff, it's like when you don't get too emotionally affected by things like detrimentally, it can be really good. Like there's stories my friends have told me with co-founders where like they just get like they got like too crazy, like they like have a huge fight and explode whenever something didn't go their way, and it's like it's very tough to or like you can't cry all the time in this business, right? Like unfortunately, like and like that's not to say like there's times where you can totally like let your feelings out, and like that's cool, and like we gotta have a place for that. But I also think that like you have to be able to kind of manage these things a little bit, and then find the time to figure that stuff out. But like anyways, more so like less about the mental health stuff and more about just like the general life thing of just like focusing on your goal, ups and downs, kind of like the stock market. Generally, stock market goes up and down, and it can look like it's going to hell. But then you spread out a year, and it's like, well, I'm actually up like 30%. You know what I mean? Like, so that's kind of how I'd view like life. And so I think that if you live it that way and you live kind of focused, I think that's been a pretty helpful trait in a way of looking at things.
Mhm. Okay. If you could go back in time right now, what are things that you know now that you wished you knew a few years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think bunch of stuff, right? Like I mean, there's like the logistics things of like, hey, I wouldn't hire all these like I think the stuff maybe overall theme is like the stuff that looks really good on paper ends up not being the stuff that's that important. And so that's like hiring a bunch of people. Yeah, it's a cool flex, and then you realize that like you're actually just as productive as you would have been if you had a tenth of the burn and you had like three people that were hustling. You know what I mean? Like, or
Elite.
and again, this is early stage advice. This is not like when you're Series A and you want to grow your team. Um, and then the second piece would be like raising a bunch of money. Cool, but also like similarly, that doesn't substitute you actually need to build a business, right? And then even the press stuff. I mean, I'm happy to do this, but like I don't do a ton of press anymore because I just don't find it's that useful, and I'd rather just focus on like hustling. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And so I think like all those type of things, like, hey, they look really good, and I have friends that still do it, and that's cool, and they can kind of what they deem important may be very different than what I think is important, right? But like I'd say overall theme is like that type of flash stuff does not substitute you from actually doing the work. Um, and if I had known that years ago, it's like cool. I would have probably been a lot more focused on my stuff versus I spent a lot of time and brain space on like how can I talk about this? How can I like position myself? How can I get on these podcasts? Like how can I push an article? Like we bought two companies when we were first starting Frenter, like very small acquisitions that I did for strategic reasons, but also because I thought it was like cool. And guess what? Nobody gives a shit about like the company you acquire when you're a pre-seed company that's raised 100K. Like, you know what I mean? Like it, no one thinks you're a $1 billion company. You know what I mean? So like, I would say that's kind of um, the lessons of like, I think you can waste a lot of money and time and brain space on like unimportant flashy stuff that's like just a total waste. Which, you know, I know it's the fun stuff. It's fun to do the press releases. It's fun to do that kind of stuff. But, um, you know, it doesn't make a difference at the end of the day.
Yeah. All right. My final question. Do you have any like last thoughts or words of encouragement for young founders?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, it's like it's don't get caught up in all like the kind of craziness of things, and like, you know, you find something you're interested in. I think the secret to success, in my opinion, is like you work on one thing, one industry, one type of project for a long time, and whether that's many companies but the same field, or whether that's you know, the same company but you've gone within a bunch of different industries. I think that like there's some people get to success faster, some people get there slower, but at the end of the day, I think that like what is a similar trend is that they all had something they wanted to focus on, locked in on. So I would
Yeah.
say like just do that and you'll probably do pretty okay. So
All right. Thank you so much, Zach.
for sure, man. Appreciate it.